Before the enemy ever fired a shot, George Patton wanted his men scared. Scared of him, because Patton believed one thing above everything else: fear saved lives. And for a time he was right, but the man behind that fear, he was hiding something no one expected. This is his story. 1943, somewhere in occupied France, a town called Langres. A young liaison officer was assigned to escort an American general. The general had never visited this town before, not once in his life. The officer offered to show him around. The general refused. "You don't have to," he said. "I know it well." The officer was confused, but he followed anyway. What happened next stopped him cold. The general walked through the streets with complete confidence. He pointed out the exact location of ancient Roman temples, the amphitheater, the drill ground, the forum. He even showed the spot where Julius Caesar himself had made camp. These were sites buried for 2,000 years. No map led there. No guidebook described them. Yet this American general walked among them like he was coming home. Later, when someone asked how he knew, he had a simple answer. It felt like someone was whispering directions in his ear. That general was George Smith Patton. He believed he had lived before, many times, as a Roman soldier, as a knight, as a Napoleonic marshal. He believed war was not something he learned. It was something he remembered. But that belief was only the beginning. The real question was what kind of man builds an empire of fear, and what he needed so desperately to hide. It all worked. For a while, but not forever. The man who walked through Langres like a ghost from ancient Rome did not start his life as a warrior. He started as a boy who was terrified he was ordinary. George Smith Patton was born on November 11th, 1885, San Gabriel, California. His family had been soldiers for generations. His ancestors fought in the American Revolution. They bled in the Civil War. Military service was not just a tradition in the Patton household, it was destiny. The boy grew up surrounded by war stories. His father read them to him. His aunt reinforced them. By the time George was old enough to understand, he already knew what he was supposed to become. A hero, but there was a problem. George Patton could not read. Not properly. Not the way other children could. Words on the page moved and scrambled. Letters reversed themselves. Reading aloud in class turned into episodes of humiliation. His classmates mocked him. They called him lazy. They called him stupid. He was 11 years old when he finally learned to read, and even then, it never came easy. Today, we would call it dyslexia. In 1896, it barely had a name. So, Patton adapted. He memorized everything. His aunt, a woman named Nanny, would read to him for hours each day. History, battles, generals. He absorbed it all through listening, because reading defeated him. He trained his memory the way other boys trained their bodies. In 1904, he entered West Point, the most elite military academy in the country. And there, his struggles only got worse. He failed mathematics. He had to repeat his entire first year while his classmates moved on without him. The shame was real. He wrote to his childhood sweetheart, a young woman named Beatrice Ayer. Patton wrote, "I am either very lazy or very stupid, or both. It is beastly hard for me to learn." He was not lazy. He was not stupid. His mind simply worked in a way the world did not yet understand. He graduated 46th out of 103 cadets. Not last, but nowhere close to first. Now here is what matters. Here is what most people never learn. The George Patton the world would come to fear was not born. He was built. The swagger was practiced. The profanity was rehearsed in front of mirrors. The ivory-handled pistols were a costume. His actual speaking voice was high-pitched, not the deep, gravelly tone people imagine. Every piece of the legend was constructed deliberately, over decades, by a man who spent his entire childhood convinced he was broken. The most terrifying general in the Allied army was a performance, built by a boy who was terrified he was ordinary. And he spent the rest of his life making sure no one ever found that out. The performance needed a stage. It took a war to give him one. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Patton was a junior officer with a reputation for being difficult and ambitious. He was also one of the few men in the entire army who understood what was coming. Not just trench warfare, something new, something that would change how armies moved and killed. The tank. In January of 1918, Patton became one of only 2 officers assigned to the newly formed Tank Corps. The United States Army had exactly 0 tanks. Patton had to build the program from the ground up. He studied the machines. He learned how they fought. He wrote the training manuals himself. He was 22 years old. On September 12, 1918, Patton led his tanks into combat at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. It was the first time American tanks had ever seen action in war, and they worked. The enemy line crumbled faster than anyone expected. But the war was not finished with Patton yet. 2 weeks later, on September 26th, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began. Patton was pushing his tanks forward when an enemy machine gun pinned his position down. His tanks stalled. His men looked to him. He got out of his vehicle. He ran across open ground under fire. He rallied his men on foot, shouting orders as bullets tore through the air around him. Then he was hit. A shell fragment tore into his leg. He kept commanding from where he fell. For 1 full hour, he directed the battle from a shell hole in the ground. They eventually pulled him back. The wound was serious. But Patton had done something that day that no amount of rehearsal could have taught him. He had proven he was not afraid to bleed for what he believed in. The First World War ended 2 months later, and then came the years no one talks about. The 20s and the 30s stretched out long and quiet for Patton. The army shrank. Promotions dried up. The tanks he had fought so hard to build were mothballed. He spent years pushing paper, teaching cavalry tactics at dusty posts across the country. But he never stopped studying war. He read obsessively. He wrote. He trained his body. He kept the performance sharp even when no one was watching. He was waiting. Then 1943 came, and everything changed. In February of that year, the Allied forces in North Africa suffered one of their worst defeats of the entire war. At a place called Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, German forces shattered the American Second Corps. The defeat was total. The troops were broken. Their commander was gone. The army needed someone to fix what was left. They chose Patton. On March 6, 1943, he took command of the Second Corps. What he found was chaos. Soldiers sleeping past dawn. Equipment left scattered and uncleaned. Men had stopped believing they could fight. Patton saw all of it on his first morning. And on that first morning, he made his decision. By 7:30 in the morning, he had shut down the mess hall. No one eats until discipline is restored. He ordered every officer to inspect their troops immediately. He drove through the camps himself, stopping at every unit, every barracks, every motor pool. What he said to those soldiers, the specific words, no one wrote down completely. But every man who was there remembered the feeling. Patton told them they were going to fight. He told them they were going to win. And he told them that if they did not shape up, he would personally see to it that they were destroyed. He meant every word. Over the next 10 days, the Second Corps transformed. Discipline returned. Equipment was cleaned and maintained. Soldiers began to stand straight again. The fear Patton planted in them became fuel. On March 17th, the rebuilt corps fought at El Guetar. They held their ground against a German counterattack that should have broken them. They did not break. Patton had turned a shattered army into a fighting force in 10 days. Word spread fast. Within weeks, every Allied commander in North Africa knew his name. Within months, the Pentagon assigned him to lead the invasion of Sicily. The invasion of Sicily launched on July 9th, 1943. Patton turned it into a race. His 7th Army raced against Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army to see who could reach Messina first. Montgomery had more men, more support, more of everything. Patton didn't care. He pushed his soldiers harder than Montgomery ever would have dared. On August 17th, 1943, Patton's forces entered Messina first. The race was won. Sicily was taken. And George Patton had become one of the most famous generals on the Allied side of the war. He had risen from a broken boy who could not read to a commander who could move entire armies with fear alone. The performance was working, but the biggest moment was still ahead of him, and it would almost destroy everything he had built. By the spring of 1944, George Patton was the most dangerous weapon the Allied command possessed, and they knew it. The invasion of France was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. The Germans knew it was coming. The only question was where and when. Patton was given command of the Third Army, one of the largest and most powerful forces the United States had ever assembled. Hundreds of thousands of men. Tanks, artillery, and enough firepower to tear through anything in their path. But before a single soldier crossed into France, Patton needed to do something first. He needed to make them believe. In the final days of May and the first days of June, 1944, Patton delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in military history. He did not read it from notes. He never read anything from notes. He had memorized every word. And he delivered it multiple times, to different groups of troops, each time from memory, each time with the same precision. This was not improvisation. This was performance at its highest level. The speech opened the way Patton always opened, with a declaration of war against fear itself. He told his soldiers that no man in history had ever won a war by dying for his country. The men who won wars were the ones who made the enemy die for theirs. The soldiers had heard commanders speak before. They had heard rank and authority. What Patton gave them was something different. He gave them permission to be brutal. He told them that the Americans were a fighting people, that their fathers and grandfathers had fought and bled and killed, that it was in their blood, that the enemy did not stand a chance against men who had been born to wage war. The profanity was deliberate. The vulgarity was calculated. Patton knew exactly what those words did to young men standing in formation. They loosened something. They unlocked something. They made the idea of killing an enemy feel less like a moral weight and more like a duty. By the time Patton finished, the soldiers were not just motivated. They were angry at the enemy, angry at fear, angry at anything that stood between them and victory. That was exactly what Patton wanted. No official transcript of the speech was ever made. What survives comes from the memories of dozens of soldiers who were there. Each man remembered it slightly differently, but they all remembered one thing the same way. They remembered how it made them feel. Private accounts described soldiers leaving the speech ready to fight. Some described it as the moment they stopped being afraid. Others said it was the first time they understood why they were there. One soldier wrote years later that Patton did not speak to them like a commander speaking to troops. He spoke to them like a man who had been to war inside his own mind his entire life and had finally found the real thing. He had no idea how close that was to the truth. The Third Army speech was the moment George Patton reached the top of everything he had built. The boy who could not read had become the general who could make an entire army believe they were unstoppable. The performance had never been better. But Patton was not finished yet, because before this speech, before D-Day, before the liberation of France, something else had already happened, something that would crack the whole thing open. And it happened in Sicily, in a hospital, in August of 1943. But that story belongs to the next chapter. George Patton built an empire out of fear. He made soldiers believe they could do the impossible. He made commanders trust him with their armies. He made the enemy afraid before he ever set foot on the battlefield. And for a time, it worked perfectly. But fear has a breaking point. So does the man who uses it. On August 3rd, 1943, while Sicily was still being fought, Patton visited a field hospital near Palermo. He walked through the rows of wounded men. Some had lost limbs. Some had burns across half their bodies. Some were fighting fevers that would kill them within days. And in one corner of that hospital, he found a soldier with no visible wound. The man was sitting on a crate, shaking. He could not stop shaking. A doctor told Patton the soldier was suffering from combat exhaustion, what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. Patton did not see a broken man. He saw a coward. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in the history of the American military. Patton crossed the room. He stood over the soldier. He slapped him across the face with an open hand. The soldier flinched. Patton slapped him again. He told the man to get up. He told him there was no such thing as combat exhaustion. He told him that men were dying, and that this soldier was going to get back into the fight or Patton would shoot him himself. Then he turned and walked out. The soldier had done nothing wrong. He was not a coward. He was a man whose mind had shattered under the weight of what he had seen and endured, and Patton had just assaulted him in front of a room full of witnesses. Word spread through the army within hours. Within days, it reached the press. Within weeks, it became the biggest scandal of Patton's career. General Eisenhower considered relieving him of command entirely. He did not, but Patton paid for what he had done. He was forced to apologize publicly to every unit in Sicily. He was sidelined for months, while other generals moved into France without him. The man who had spent his entire life building a mask of fearlessness had just revealed exactly what was underneath. Because George Patton did not just use fear as a weapon against his enemies. He used it against himself. The boy who could not read. The cadet who failed his first year. the man who wrote letters calling himself stupid. He never stopped believing those things. He just buried them deeper and deeper under layers of profanity and bravado and carefully rehearsed rage. And in that hospital in Sicily, the mask slipped. Not because Patton was cruel, because he was terrified. Terrified that weakness was real. Terrified that if he allowed it in others, he would have to admit it existed in himself. The greatest general the Americans had in World War II was a man at war with his own mind. Every speech, every slap, every moment of constructed fury was a fight against the one thing he could never defeat, the fear that he was ordinary. George Patton went on to lead the Third Army through France and into Germany. He died in December of 1945, just weeks after the war ended, a blood clot, quietly, almost without notice. But the paradox he left behind did not die with him. In the next episode, we go deeper, into the slapping incident, into what it cost him, into the man Patton became when the cameras were off and the soldiers were gone and there was no one left to perform for. But fear has a breaking point, and Patton was only just beginning to find his. This is War Maestro Chronicles, the generals who ruled by fear, the men behind the masks. Drop a comment. Was Patton a hero or a performance? Subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.